Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. So as Chris has said, we'll be going through customizing Mathematica using style sheets. And the idea of today's talk is, so there is this concept within Mathematica of a special kind of notebook called a style sheet that just contains what we call style definitions. And that's just what tells the front end and tells the notebook how to style itself. So we'll talk about why different styles get different styles, how we define that, and how we can make our own styles and kind of change the default behavior of a notebook and also the default look of a notebook. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about just general notebook structure. So for anyone that's a little bit familiar with notebooks, you'll be aware that everything that you input into a notebook goes in its own cell. So if I want to input a title cell, that'll be its own distinct cell called the title cell. Subtitles the same, chapters the same. There is a bunch of different cell types, and they will all get kind of different styling and different rules depending on what type they are. You'll have a default input. You'll have a default cell type. So if I do any sort of new cell by default, it will go into that, which by default is input. Some of them will be evaluatable, some of them will not be, and so on, right? But the general structure of all of these is actually the same. So let's show that now. So the general structure of all of these cells is basically just a cell with some cell contents and a second argument that denotes the type of cell it is, the cell style. So for example, an output cell in this case would have some box data within the first argument, and the second argument says, okay, this is an output cell, so apply the output style definitions on this cell when you display it. So cell by default, cell is actually a sort of lower level, it's a low level representation of things that you don't usually kind of type out yourself. So if I evaluate just this cell here, just on its own, the front end won't know to display that. The kernel, won't know to render that, because these is what the actual front end reads and renders, right? So if I want to emulate that, if I want to send some box data, some cell to the kernel to be displayed as if it was rendered by the front end, I can use something called display form. So I'm just going to define this cell and run it through display form, and that's going to generate this cell, which is what it represents, what this cell would look like if rendered by the front end. So another thing is you can look at the full form of any of these cells. So you can look at the underlying form of any of these cells using Control-Shift-E. So if I select any of these cells, or if I'm kind of hovered within them, I can do Control-Shift-E, and that will expand the full form of this cell. And that is the symbolic representation of this cell. This whole notebook is defined symbolically. It's a notebook that contains a collection of cells, and these cells contain either text data or box data of some kind, have some type, and then the front end will read all of this stuff and render it in a kind of specific way. Right, so we can do that on any cell, Control-Shift-E, and that will show us its contents. Something else you'll notice is the data that goes into the cell is not just kind of the usual Wolfram language functions. There is still a symbolic Wolfram language expression. However, it's in these low-level box representations, which you almost never will write manually. Boxes are almost never something you will manually define. A lot of these will also be kind of undocumented. But the idea is that is what the kernel that is what the kernel generates, and that is what the front end can understand and render, right? So that anytime I give some input to the kernel, like let's think here. So let's say some button, right? Button with some text. Oop. Right, that does nothing. So actually what the kernel outputs when it evaluates this button function is some box data, this button box expression with some arguments that denote its behavior and label and so on, right? And that is what actually the front end can understand and render as a button. Cool. So with that distinction made between kind of boxed front-end renderable structures and also the code that you write, so those two things are, we need to make the distinction that those two things tend to be separate, right? So one is generated code, so this box data would be generated code, and the other is code that you would actually write. Cool. Right, so all cells, as we said, so they'll have a type, they'll have some cell style or some name to them that will denote their properties, right? Like output, title, input, and so on. And what these properties are defined as, they're basically just options. They're given in as options to that cell expression, right? So let's show an example of that. We've got this input cell here, so x equals 10, x squared, and then we get some output. If I select the input, I can do Control-Shift-E, for example, and see that by default, Mathematica will put a cell label on all input and output cells, right? So it'll put an in label on the input cells, an out label on the output cells. And if I wanted to remove that, for example, so at the kind of base level of changing these options, and you wouldn't usually do this way, but just to illustrate the point, I could just go in there, remove the option from the cell, and that would re-render as the same thing, just without the labels, right? So that is the first level that cells will kind of look for properties. If they've got any properties in the options, any options in the options, that will take precedence over anything else. However, they can also not have options as is shown. So like when I remove that cell label, we have no options. We just have box data and a second argument of type. So there are some actual inherited options that come in from the fact that we are telling this cell that it is an input cell. So there is some style definition somewhere else that get brought in, and when we'll get to where they come from, right? But the very top level of this, what takes precedence over everything else, is the options within this cell. So if I put anything within here, that will take precedence over anything that's inherited in by what cell type you are or anything else. Cool. So we can do something similar, change the color of text. So here's a subsection cell. We could just go in and do a font weight bold or font color blue and change that manually. There is a lot of cell options, actually way more than even the documentation center can list out in a list, but most of them are there, so you can kind of go in and have a look at the extensive list. You can basically customize anything from margins, padding, colors, and even whether something is evaluatable, editable, and so on. Right. So I keep saying that, when I do the full form thing, this is not how you'd usually change options. And usually you'd either do it through the front end or programmatically, right? And through the front end, what I mean by that, if I exit full screen here, I mean things like, I can change the options of a cell by using the kind of user interface of Mathematica to go into cell, for example, change the groupings here, or go into format and change the font or the face of the font, the size, and so on. And all of these would basically map to some option applying to that cell. So let's try this orange. And that will just add that option to this cell, right? So that's doing it the kind of, the way that you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to open the full form of the cell and kind of add options in there manually, though you can. You can just ask the front end to do it for you. So change it to orange, change it to, let's change it back to, let's just change it to cyan. Okay. We'll just do italic, so I'm not looking around. Cool. So another thing we can do is get options. So aside from going in manually and using your using the interface to change stuff, a lot of the times you'll want to do this programmatically. You'll want to build your own interfaces to do this stuff, or you'll just want to build some code to kind of do it for you. And all of that stuff is in there as well. So if you want to get options, you can use the function called options. And there are some other functions that will get, if you've got a selected cell, if you've got a selected notebook, and so on, they will return those as symbolic objects. Because again, remember, the notebook itself is represented as a symbolic object. The cells within it are symbolic objects, and basically everything represented here can be represented as a symbolic object. So we can grab here. We can build just an example button where we grab the options of whatever selected cell we have. So we'll grab the first element of this because selected cells returns a list. And then the option we want to grab is font family. So we'll just build a button here where if we've got any cell and we click this button, it will output and will print out the font that is written in. If we want to change options, the function is very similar. Is just instead of options is set options, and instead of just giving the option name, we actually give a rule where it goes to whatever we want to change the option to. So, for example, if I want to change the background of the entire kind of notebook that we're evaluating this code in, so evaluation notebook, set the option of background to pink, I can just do that. And if I want to change it back to what it was, I can change it to inherited, and that will actually go in and grab it from a level above. We've not talked about inheritance yet, but we'll actually get to it shortly. So I'll change it back to inherited, so it grabs it from whatever other style definitions are coming into this notebook. Right, so when it comes to these default options that I keep referring to, so when a cell has no options, there's a few places that these get grabbed on. So the first place is, as we said, the cell options. So the place after that is the notebook itself. So if I, for example, before we get to all the directories, I'll go back here. So if we do an example structure here, so notebook, which will be like this, and that will contain a bunch of cells, right? So this is the symbolic representation of a notebook. So cell with some data, some type, right? And then this will have some options. But then the notebook itself can also have inherited notebook, it can have style definitions itself, right? So instead of just directly going to an input cell and saying you have these options, if I want all input cells to have some option, this is where I define them. So notebook will have a style definitions option, and again, this is documented. Let me just pull that up. So there is this style definitions options, and this is what you actually give all those style definitions to, where you say, okay, this is what an input cell, this is what an input cell should look like. This is what an output cell should look like. This is their default options, right? And it's also where all of these are defined. So by default, Mathematica doesn't know about any cell types. All of them come from one of these style sheets, right? So what does this option look like? Well, what it actually looks like is another notebook. These style definitions just take another notebook like so, right? But now this notebook will have special cells within it. But again, they're structured the same. The only thing that's different within them is that instead of taking box data or text data or just a string, they'll take style data, right? And then they can define either what type they're giving these options to, so style data of input, for example, and then I can give a bunch of options to say this is the kind of the default input cell, and these are all its options, right? And then I can continue on for all of the kind of cells that I want my notebook to know about. Another thing I can do is inherit of another notebook that looks exactly the same. And this is exactly what a style sheet is. All it is this notebook, right? It's the notebook that we give to style definitions with all the style data for our notebook. So let's actually talk about the default one. So there is a default one that is used when you just open Mathematica called default.nb, and all of the default style sheets are stored in your installation directory. There is a front end style sheets directory here. So in my case, it's in there. We can just open it here in this case, and you'll have a bunch of them. And these are all the defaults used. So default is the kind of highest level one for the notebook, is the one used in notebooks. There are ones that are used in packages. So when you open .wl, there is ones in scripts, so .wls, style sheet formatting, how you'd format a style sheet itself, and so on. So all the defaults are in there, but usually you wouldn't really come in here and edit these, right? A better thing to do is actually you can override these, because everything is on an inheritance. Everything is on an inheritance system. You can actually override a lot of these options by kind of putting another style sheet kind of further up in the chain, right? So to get the notebook, to get the style sheet of a notebook, we can just use options again. So options, evaluation notebook, style sheet definitions. That will just give us, as you can see, just one of these large notebooks. So we'll have these cells with style data within them. And you'll notice this first one that instead of having any specific style type, so all the other ones will have, okay, so style data author note, style data text, style data, some cell type, style data WolframU logo. But you will have this top cell that actually doesn't have a cell type. It doesn't have a cell style, but just has its own style definitions that point to some other file or some other notebook. And this just means that we're inheriting all style definitions from default. So in the case of this notebook, for example, we're using the WolframU style sheet, which inherits from the default. So you can just say style definition on your top cell. You can say style data goes to style definitions of default, and that means all of those come in. However, whatever you define in this notebook will override those, right? So I can use the default, but also override whatever I want to change. So let me delete this because it's pretty long. And also, just to before I move on, just to say that these, you can point these directly as embedded notebooks, or you can point this to a file location. And just know that if you embed it as a notebook like this, it makes it completely portable. So I can send this to someone and I don't need to send a separate file, but obviously, it still gets stored in the file. So the size of that file will kind of shoot up instead of using a file, but then you'd have to send the file separately. So let's have a look at this default, just to see what an kind of built-in style sheet looks like. So when you open one of these, you'll see this is our first look at a style sheet, and this is what they look like. They've got their own styling, and these style cells will look, will have a different look. So you don't usually see these in your usual kind of notebooks. Another thing is you'll notice that I can't edit these. So a lot of these will, I can just click on them and select them. And the way you work with style sheets now is by using that Control-Shift-E full form. So I can actually come in here, and if I want to change, in this case, it's the default, so I cannot edit. But if I wanted to edit this notebook, Control-Shift-E opens the full form of that. So here it is, cell style data of notebook, and here's the default options of notebooks using default. So there's some page headers, there's some footer lines, there's the first page face is right, and so on. So we set our default options there. And now anything that's using this, when you open a notebook, it will by default have these options. If I wanted to change them, I can add, remove to them, and so on. You'll notice as well, our inheritance gets its own style. So we've got at the top, inheriting base definitions from Stylesheet core. So this is what inheritances will look like. So again, it's just a cell, style data, style definitions, points to another file somewhere. I can actually click this and open the core definitions are basically what every default definition draws from. They're just some base definitions that almost everything makes use of. Cool. So when it comes to actually defining your own style cells, like we said, you just give it some style data, and either you can give a few different forms. So let's go through those forms actually in detail now. So one thing is I can just give the name of a type. So cell style data, some string of a name, and this can be anything. It doesn't have to be an existing cell. This is the definition of that cell. So I can name it whatever. I can give arbitrary types. I can define my own new cell styles like this. Right. So cell data input, and then whatever options I put within this will get applied to that. Again, we can use arbitrary names, and some more forms we can use are the following. So one thing is we can do, as we saw, we can just give it style definitions to just inherit everything, or we can do style definitions, go to some different style data of input, for example. Right. And what this means is create this new cell style called new cell style, but inherit all the definitions from whatever the definitions of input is. So I can also inherit from specific cells, not just the entire notebooks. Right. Just a little note on full form. So as I said, you'll be working in this Control-Shift-E form a lot. So as I've said, it is a very low level representation of things, and it's not being evaluated by the kernel. Anything I put in here is meant to be already at its most evaluated state, right? Is meant to be in box data, and in the lowest level it can be. There are things like colors, for example, that you might use in front-end design that when you are working in a notebook, you can do stuff like yellow or green or whatever, and they will just evaluate to some actual RGB color, right? However, when I'm working in this full form, because this is not being evaluated in the same way, I can't use things like yellow, things like black, things like we've got size one, so large and small, stuff like that will not work, right? So I have to give the full form of something like RGB color, hue, or when it comes to sizes, I'd have to give a list of actual number sizes or some scaled value. But again, anything that has to be further evaluated will not work in that form. So just be aware of that. So I can try and show an example of that. So example, let's just add a cell here and try to add the option background goes to yellow. Oops. And as you can see, this does not work, and it actually also complained that this option cannot be used for background. Let's delete that so it stops complaining at us. Cool. Right. So let's talk properly about inheritance. So as we said, our styled cells have various forms that we can write them in, where we can say inherit from a different cell or inherit from a different style sheet entirely. Right. So we've already showed these forms, but what I want to do instead is talk about is open a little diagram thing and just draw a quick visualization of how this inheritance works, just because I think it's much easier. Cool. So I'll use draw.io here. So zoom in a bunch. What we'll have first, as the first level, we have some cell. Cool. Let me use a rectangle instead. Some cell, right? That will have some options. Let's do font. Right. So we've got a cell of some type. Let's actually add that in. Right. Got our cell. That will be contained within a notebook. Let me actually use a box instead. There we go. So we've got our notebook here. Cool. So we've got a notebook that will have a bunch of cells. Oh, okay, this is... Okay, cool. Right, and within this notebook, as we've seen, there'll be kind of either an embedded or a kind of pointed to some other notebook, right? So notebook, I just say style notebook, right? And we can embed this, but usually this will be kind of on its own somewhere. So we'll have these cells where they will pull first from their own options. Then a level above that, we've got our notebook options, which then can further inherit from outside. So slide that back. These can inherit from these. These are the wrong way around. Cool. Right. And then this can go on. So we can have this style notebook. We can have another one that brings in definitions. Right. And this can just go on indefinitely. These we would call kind of just standalone style sheets. These we would call embedded style definitions. And these we just call the cell options. Right. But the idea is the closer you are to the cell, the closer you are to this end, those definitions take precedence. So, right. So these font color red, it doesn't matter if I've got this style defined here with a font color yellow, these will take precedence. If I had a font color change in the notebook options instead, like so, then it would override any color options in here, but not in here, right? So this would have a yellow, for example. Let's do yellow. So this cell would now be yellow. This one would be red. All right, we're done with the slow diagram. Yeah, with fun explanation, I could not see the notebook. Okay, let me just open the diagram again. So let me just explain through inheritance a little bit again. I'm sorry about that. I think my share page crashed, so none of that actually got shared. Okay. So as we were saying, we will have a notebook with a bunch of cells, right? I'm not actually showing anything. Let me just put this on screen and actually double check this time. Okay. So I got here our notebook. And that has a bunch of cells. Cell within there. And this cell has some cell style, right? It's an input cell, let's say, input, and it has some options. Let's just say font color. It goes to red, right? So that is defined in the actual cell options, right? And we might have multiples of these. We'll have a bunch of them. So there's a list in the first argument of the notebook is a list. So we'll have a list of a bunch of these cells. And then within the notebook, we also have an option, as we saw, oops, wrong button. We have an option of style definitions. Style definitions, which it itself, actually, let's make this one of these style defs, right? So these can be a bunch of things, and this is what any cell within this notebook will draw from. So let's draw that. So all these cells will draw style definitions from here, right? And this can contain a bunch of things. So one thing it can contain, let's just copy this. It can contain itself a notebook, a style notebook, right? So one of these notebooks that we saw, that contains a bunch of style data, right? So we've got a notebook here that is within our style definitions. Cool. But that itself can now inherit. So let us draw those inheritance notebooks. There could be some other style sheet notebook with a bunch of style data within a bunch of style cells within that, and then we can inherit from this as well. So this could have an inheritance cell that draws from that. And then again, this can go on indefinitely, right? So that one could draw from a different one, style sheet 2, and so on, right? So what I was saying earlier is that the closer you, what takes precedence is what is closest to this cell, right? So if I've got some options in the actual cell itself, like font color red. So let's do one of these with an option, one of these with not, right? So this input would take the default of input, which is let's say white, and the other one is red. The other one is the other one comes in from the cell options. So we've got one that comes in from either here. Let's actually draw it here. In input def, so I'm not going to write the whole thing. So there's some input definitions here that define that color as white. It comes in, that would be white. This would take precedence. If I've got some different input definitions up here, again, what would take precedence, let's call these something else. Let's call these input definitions 2, right? So what would take precedence is whatever is closest to this cell. This would override this, which would override this, and so on. And there is no limit to inheritance. You can just keep kind of inheriting on. Sorry about the rush. I literally had to the kind of not showing the first time threw me off. Sorry about that. All right, let me get back to the normal presentation. Right, let's actually talk about making these. Right. There's a few different ways. I actually do need to go off full screen. There's a few different ways. One way is through GUI. So you can just go into Format, Edit Style Sheet, and this will actually open the notebook. So that embedded notebook itself, it will open that as a graphical notebook. So I can edit it not programmatically. So I can come in and do Control-Shift-E, open these cells, and change them. So as you'll see, this is the WolframU style sheet. This is what this let me zoom in a bunch as well. This is what this notebook is drawing from, but it itself, as you can see, is inheriting from default itself, right? So we're building that inheritance tree. And again, we've got some new cell types. So these are not defined in kind of default Mathematica. These are new that we defined for WolframU. We've got author nodes and so on. And if I wanted to edit something, I can just come in here. Let's make this smaller. Let's find some section. I can just come in here and make a change. So let's change the font color to just take out all the red from it, right? So is this a subsection? If I save this, oh, I think it might be a subsection. Let's see. Anywho, we might need to restart the front end, but we can change these, save it, restart, and that will get applied and embedded into this notebook. And the difference between this and put it into say a different notebook is that if I send this notebook out, then all the style definitions will work. Whereas if it inherits from say something that is not built in, so default is fine. If I send anything that inherits from default is fine, because I can, I can reasonably assume that anyone running Mathematica will have the defaults in their installation directory. However, if I inherit from anything else, any custom style sheet of my own, then I would have to send that out. And I would also have to kind of know its exact directory unless I put it in one of the front-end directories, right? And I'll show that in a bit. But for now, we'll continue on with making your own. So that is one way you can open it through here. Another way is front-end token execute, edit style sheet definitions. This will open the same thing. And from here, there's a bunch of things we can do. So let us define a new cell, right? So if I want to define a new cell, one thing I can do is if there are existing definitions, I can just Control C, Control V. I can start also typing anything to get a new cell and Control-Shift-E to go into that. But the best way to do it is just to go into the toolbar, add new style, give it a name, some name. And this is where I can also give inheritance. So this will list out all all defined cells, all cells that are known about in the kind of existing styles that I can inherit from. So if I want to have this inherit from text code, we can do that, and that will just create our style cell here. Control-Shift-D will show it's exactly as we'd expect. Style data, some name, style definitions that inherit from text. And then we can now go in and change any options we want. This menu sort and value, by the way, it just tells Mathematica's toolbar, which I've got disabled here, how to kind of where to sort this this style. Let's delete this for now. So usually you won't actually have embedded definitions, and usually you will just have something that points to a directory. So if you do want to embed definitions, an easy way to do that is just to import, to take whatever you are using as your current style definitions, import that in as a notebook, which will just import the expression itself, and then set your style definitions to that. And again, if you want to get that, is options. Style definitions, right? So if in this case it's already embedded, if this was just a directory, I can take this option, the value of that, and just apply it here. So literally, yeah. So I could just put this into here. So something like this would take whatever our existing directory is, import it in as a notebook, and set that, embed those definitions into the notebook. But again, do remember that the bigger that notebook is, the size of your notebook can grow kind of really, really quickly, because they take quite a bit of space. It's basically an entirely new notebook just embedded in. Right. Another thing is you won't really, so there's a lot of options, and that's why I've not been really covering specifics. And because of this, there is an easy way to go through them and edit them, and that's the options inspector. You can go into format options to open it. So format option inspector, or just Control-Shift-O. This is the option inspector. Sadly, I cannot zoom this in because it's tied to my actual window size. But what it is, we'll just go through these pictures here. So you've got this window where it will actually list all the different levels of options. So if you remember, there are global options, there are notebook options, cell options, and so on. We can select from specific currently running notebooks. So I can say, let's only change the options of my currently selected notebook, or this specific notebook that is now running. Once you do that, you can kind of see the options in different categories, and they're all listed out. You'll see the current option now, and a lot of these will be documented. So a lot of these, if you kind of just copy paste that name into the documentation center, they will most of the time be documented, although some of these might not be. Some of the kind of lower level options might not be documented. Cool. So let's keep moving about default cell type. So as we said at the start, there is a default style to when I open a notebook and I import a cell, I don't have to tell it what style it is. It just chooses a default. And the way it does that is, again, it just is set in the notebook options, and it's just default new cell style. And then I just give it the name or the style of the default cell, and that would just do that. So if I run this now, anytime I type anything new, it will be a text cell instead of an input cell. So if I do a lot of kind of document writing instead of code writing, then I can change my default to text instead of input. And I can also do this through option inspector. So Control-Shift-O, I can go to the lookup and do default new cell style for the selected notebook, or for global options as well, if I want to change the options for my Mathematica installation as a whole. And the way it does that, the way it stores these kind of global options is in this object called the $front end. And as with the notebooks, as with before, where I can do set options of the evaluation notebook, I can do the same here. So I can do set options of $front end to some new value where we set it back. Just remember that these are global. So front end is global and persistent. So if I change this to text, close the session and reopen, that will persist. So my default cell style will always be input. There is a few options that I've listed here that could be useful, that are not really that documented. So let's just go through them now. So style key mapping is a very useful one when you want to write your own styles that have almost their own shortcuts. So you'll notice when you use Mathematica, there is some things like, say, when you press, let's change my cell style back to input. And let's go back. So if I press equals, for example, you'll see that instead of getting an input cell, now I get something else. I get this Wolfram Alpha short input. Or if I press equals again, it will change to a different cell. Same with, I think in text, there is a bunch of shorthands. So if I press, if I do, I forget all the shorthands. But basically, we can set a key where if I click that key, so for example, equals in input. So if the first input of an input cell, is this an input cell? Yep. If the first keystroke of an input cell is equals, so like this, it will switch to something else. So that is exactly what this style key mapping is. So in my style definitions in my style sheet, there is a style key mapping that says when I press equals within this style, so this would be within the input. When I press equals and you've got an input cell, change it to this other thing, right? So in this case, we'll change it to a Wolfram Alpha short. Let's close that. So something I do in mine is set backtick to open code. Let's see if this will just do it. So let's backtick on this. So if you can see here, so now I've set this. If I click backtick as the first keystroke of an input or code cell, I can switch back and forth. Because what I've done is, so I've said within the input, if I do style key mapping, backtick goes to code, and I've done the same exact thing, but in reverse from code. So from code, I press backtick, go back to input. And again, I can just now easily switch between them. And another thing I do, I'll just mention it here because it's not kind of written. So this is nice because you can also change the initialization, the initialization of a cell. So whether it runs by default as you run anything in a cell. So if I go into a notebook, open a fresh notebook, and do Shift Enter on anything, it will first go to some specific cells that have this initialization cell set to true, right? And I can do that again from the style sheet and say all input cells are initialization cells, or all code cells are not initialization cells, and so on. Cool. So it's just an easy way to turn initialization on and off for me. All right, menu command key. This is another similar way, just a kind of hotkey to get to that cell. So instead of having to be in a specific in a specific cell, you can just do Alt and that key to kind of open that. So by default, there is like Alt 1, Alt 2, Alt 3, Alt 4. Alt number will actually change to a bunch of different styles. So that was section. So Alt 7, I think is text. So let's see, Alt 7. What are we changing here? Alt 7. So yeah, that is, what is Alt 7? Alt 7 is not set. Okay. So we've got Alt 6. That is subsection. But basically, you can set this, and this doesn't matter what cell I'm in. I don't have to be in a specific kind of cell to do Alt and keystroke to then get to a different cell. This just works anywhere. Right. So in this case, we'd have some, when some new cell type that gets entered when we do Alt N, for example. Auto style options and code assist options. So this, if you notice in the notebook, these kind of syntax highlighting stuff, or the kind of auto style options where you select your encompassing group. So in this case, you'll select my the list that I'm within and also the function that I'm within, and I can change these colors if I want. So so head highlight is the name of that. I can also change the color of any other code style. So if you notice in input cells, for example, we don't just have one color. So as I was saying earlier, usually you set the font color of a cell by just doing font color goes to red, and then the font color is red. But in any code cells, any cells that interpret their input as code, we can have these auto style options that change different things. So give us syntax coloring, so it makes code easier to write. So we can change the color of strings, for example. By default, they're gray, but I can set them to yellow, for example. Let's set that. So now we've got, if I select some group, we'll see our head highlight style is now, it has got the background of purple, and now all our strings within this file are yellow. Notebook autosave and closing autosave. There's not much to say about these other than they're actually just useful when it comes to autosaving. Notebook autosave will autosave every time you evaluate a cell. So anytime I evaluate anything, it will save. And closing autosave will autosave anytime I close the notebook. So they're both options for the notebook itself. And yeah, they're just useful for not losing work a lot of the time. So window frame elements is these stuff. So scroll bars, these inputs at the top, the zoom, the kind of zoom bar at the bottom. We can change all of them and kind of switch them out, add different ones, or remove them entirely. And those are documented in window frame elements and window elements. A kind of a little bit more of an important concept is that there is also, as we talked about those boxes, so we'll have like button boxes and panel boxes and, some object box that represents, that is a low level representation of some front end thing that we're rendering, like this plot, I think, is just it's just a panel box because we've got it in a panel, right? And the graphics, for example, are graphics boxes and so on. We can also, they will also have default options that are also dictated by the style sheet, and we can change them. We can then change them. So, for example, let's do that here. So if I've got a new example, just run empty embedded notebook here, I can just inherit all my stuff from the WolframU style sheet that we're using. And then after that, go in and change the notebook options and set the panel box options to background. So all the rest of the panel box options will remain the same, except the background of panel box. Right, so if I do that, we'll see that now any plot that I do, any panels that I do anywhere in this notebook, right, they don't have to be in a specific cell. They don't have to be in a specific style. By default, will go to background of gray. And I can do that with graphics boxes, buttons boxes, and basically all of the boxes. And it would be a good way to find that is, Control-Shift-D to look at what the box structure is. So I want to change the tag box defaults. I want to change the graphics box defaults. And then it would just be object box options. This is also kind of departing from purely aesthetics and getting into more kind of changing the functions of changing the what your notebook can do, and that is the doc cell. So by default, a lot of the notebooks that you open will have doc cells, and those are just the kind of toolbar at the top. In this case, in the slideshow, we've got the slideshow toolbar, for example, which I think I've got right here. Right. So these themselves are just cells. They're just the same kind of cell with a bunch of box data and so on. Right. And as such, we can define our own. Right, all we need to do is give the notebook a docked cell option with some cell or multiple cells with some box data in them, and they can do anything, right? We can do actually a lot with that, right? Because we can run any sort of Wolfram code in that in that docked cell. So I've got this big example here, which I'm not going to cover the code of too much because it'll take too long. But I built this somewhat overkill example of a file opener docked cell, right? So all this will do is it'll replicate kind of a VS Code sidebar thing where we've got here an Explorer view where I can dig into my notebook directory and see kind of other files. I can open these files, so I can click on these to open them. Scroll down, I can resize this, open the parent directory, and I can also, I've just built in the find and replace. So just I basically recreated the Control F box here, but docked in the top. So we can actually just show that now. So I've defined this as a cell with a bunch of box data in it, which by itself doesn't look like anything if you remember from before, because the kernel will not know to render this. But if we do display form on it, we just see an example of it. So let's actually set this. Let's set our current notebook docked cell to this. So I can do set options, evaluation notebook docked cells, and here we go. So now this is my docked cell. I can make this my default, for example, and now any notebook that I open has this nice kind of file manager thing, and I can kind of search through and find whatever I'm looking for. I hope this doesn't. Yeah, there we go. I thought it might take me to the start of the notebook. There we go. Right, so let's change it back to the normal one. So inherited. And now we get, again, our slideshow one. Yeah, so another last little thing. So you don't have to do this. You can actually just give docked cells any docked cell, but it is convention to have for docked cells themselves to have their own kind of default styles that are set in a docked cell style. You don't have to do this again. It can just be in any kind of cell. Right. So let's finish this off by talking about building your own, which is, I think, the important bit of this is if you do want to do your own stuff, change how your notebook behaves and kind of looks. Yes, you can start by just format, edit style sheet, and just make these edits from here. But what is usually easier to do is just create a brand new one and start from there. Easy ways: create a new document and edit its style definitions, or we can also just manually do this by creating a notebook that is using private style formatting notebook style sheet. So this style sheet is what actually contains the definitions for that nice doc cell. So that nice toolbar that allows us to export stuff. So if I open this, that's the style sheet that contains this toolbar and styles our sections kind of differently. So section and so on. Right. So it's a lot nicer to work in this, but just note that you don't have to actually do this. If any notebook, a plain notebook, can contain style cells, and then we can inherit from that and use them. It doesn't have to be this kind of notebook with this kind of style sheet. Right, so if we start that, let's actually open this brand new one. And what we can do is we've defined here an example kind of dark mode sample collection of changes from my DME dark mode everything style sheet that I spent a lot of time making and is still not finished. But all we can do, we can just literally, because these are just cells, I can just Control-C, Control-V, paste them in, and you'll see again they've got the nice formatting from the private style sheet definitions. I've made a bunch of changes to section styles and so on. We can now, if I want to save this, I can just export it anywhere I want. So let's do DME example.notebook example. And let's save that on the desktop. Cool. And now if I wanted to use this, I can just format, style sheet, and choose other. Other ways to do this is also I can do, if I go to the style options, there is a default. If I go to global preferences, I'm sorry, I can't make this bigger. So global preferences, default style. So there is a default style definitions option that you can change here. So if you want to change by default when you open a new notebook, what style sheet is used, you can also just change that for everything. All right, so with that said, let's just show it quickly, and then we can close out. So other desktop, where are we at? DME example. So here we go. We can have a bunch of different changes. If we go and show some input, so we can have our input here. We can have, so I've added new divider cells, for example, that have the hotkey of a dash. This one, right? So if I do dash in any input cell, it will add one of these dividers. The output is changed. So we've got any output, so the output style is changed and so on. But this is just done as an example. So a lot of these style definitions are incomplete, but you can kind of work from these